Good afternoon. Welcome to Special Collections and our first spring event for 2021. I'm Tanya Zanisch-Belcher, Director of Special Collections and Archives, and today we'll be featuring our photograph exhibit, Comacina, Improvisations and Variations, which has been curated by Paul Bright. While we can't be together to enjoy this exhibit, we have found a unique way for you to interact with our curator, Paul Bright, and hopefully it will be a rewarding visit for you. For anyone who wishes to visit the exhibit, simply contact us at archives@wfu.edu and we will make a special appointment for you to come in, and the exhibit is available through July 30th. Paul was born in Cleveland, Ohio and received his degree from the University of South Carolina. His artistic works have been presented in Europe, Canada, and the United States and reside in many private and museum collections. Paul arrived at Wake Forest in 2004 and is currently the Director of Galleries and Programming for the Wake Forest University. Today we will be sharing a short film which documents Paul's artistic and curatorial thoughts about his photographs, which form the backbone of the exhibit. Paul will also share some of the objects that appear in the exhibit. And I also want to extend my great thanks to Barry Davis of ZSR Library IT for his assistance in editing, technology, and everything else. Thank you, Barry. After our film, which should take about 20 to 25 minutes, Paul will be available to answer your questions. Simply submit them in the YouTube chat and we will read them, and then Paul will be able to respond. Again, thanks for joining us, and let's get started. Paul, thank you so much for being here today. The first question I have for you is, can you describe Comacina and what it is like for those of us who have never been there?
So Comacina is this tiny island in the middle of Lake Como. It's the only island in Lake Como. And Lake Como sits on the border of Switzerland and northern Italy. It's about 30 minutes north of Milan. And the island is about, I guess, 600 yards long and maybe 200 or 150 wide, so it's tiny. And the history is like really interesting of the place because tons of events and actually a lot of structures were packed into this place over time, and there was a lot of fighting over the island between various forces from Milan and from Como, and this went on for some time, but by about the 1150s, most of the structures had been destroyed through these wars, and what's left now are mostly remains of religious structures. There's just the basic outlines of an old church, and there's even less of some earlier churches. But the scars in the landscape remain from all the history and from these buildings. And it's interesting because I didn't know much about the place before going to it. The application for the residency, wanted you to respond to the specifics of the place in some fashion. And my idea was I would make up something for the application without knowing a lot, but basically go with an open mind and trying to absorb something about the place. So I read about its history a little bit, but mostly I just sort of arrived trying to respond to the island, what was there, what I found there. And of course, immediately what was captivating were these remnants of structures. And so in this house that we stayed in, my wife was with me on the residency. It's about a 10 or 15 minute walk to the beach. The beach is this tiny little rocky sand spit on the mainland side of the island, and back and forth to the beach you would find all sorts of things, and we're kind of inveterate pickers up of things, and we would find stones, we would find bones, we would find these mysterious things like this strange little thing that's in one of the photos, and come to find out that some of them were man-made products from fireworks, because they have this enormous festival for San Giovanni every June, and they just like blow up the island. And so there's all this detritus from that activity. But it's interesting how place and being in a place really kind of affects the work you do, even if it's so-called abstract work most of the time. An earlier residency that both Leanne and I had occupied was in Canada and at Cape Pine, and it's a very remote little appendage at the bottom of Newfoundland, and about as far east as you can go on the continent. And there's a lighthouse there, and there are buildings associated with it, and the residents reside in one of those. And we spent a month there, 2006, I believe, and collected things there. And I didn't realize what they would lead to, but like, if you look at the images in this show, you'll see that it's about relationships of two found objects. And so here's an interesting one. It's a stone that's been naturally cleaved, and here's another one that seems to just want to fit right in it. We also just found rocks and other things that interest us on those beaches as well. And this one we always called the Milky Way or the universe rock, because it looks like the sky at Cape Pine at night when it's just so full of stars that you can't even identify constellations. So it always reminded us of that experience. But that was many years ago, and in between, I didn't do much with that sort of found object. Most of my work deals with found objects in the sense of like paper material, posters, waste that I make collages out of, or sound that I record for sound collages. So it's always about finding something and working with it, sort of dealing with what's right in front of you rather than trying to apply a concept to something. The idea sort of comes from your interaction with the material, which sort of forms a basis for my work.
The title of this exhibit is Comacina, Improvisations and Variations. How did you choose that title?
Yeah, so when I was working with the objects, I was thinking about how they came to be in my head and on my work table in Comacina. What is it about them that's sort of interesting to me in arranging them and finding those relationships? And they were improvisatory. There was nothing pre-planned. It was seeing something and making a connection visually or otherwise to another thing that you combined it with. And they're variations in the sense that you'll find certain of the objects get repeated through the images. So, it's like, okay, we're going to use red rock with this thing, and that works kind of interestingly. And then this rock with that thing. And that's where the variations come in. And I always saw them as just these brief encounters between these objects, and then they would go on to have some other life with another object or in another place.
Paul, can you tell me about the relationship between these objects and what you think they represent relative to the current state of society and our obsession with possessions and ownership?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So the objects, you find them, they're already made or made by nature in some cases, and existing in the world, so you're not making this thing. In a sense, you don't really own it either, because who owns the geology, right? Or who owns the poster that's come off the billboard in Milan that I use in a collage? It's become overlooked, it's become waste in some cases. And in some cases, you're sort of borrowing the objects. Like, I sort of broke rules in bringing these in today, or even collecting them, because they don't really belong to me. I've borrowed them from this place. Many of the things that you find in the photographs that I used, I left there. But for some reason, I felt like it might be interesting to hold on to these for a little longer. And so the sense of ownership isn't as great. Obviously, if I take paper that I found and glue it into a collage, then that thing is something I've made and sent back out into the world. But it all seems like a sense of borrowing to me more than ownership. And maybe that sort of opposes the ownership ethos that we so live with now. The ownership society, remember that was from like the 2000s. Everyone was going to own everything. But it's often the things that you can't tangibly grasp and hold on to, the experiences, the ideas that are the things that really end up resonating with you. And they can be evoked by ideas, by art, by things you find, but they can also be shared in a way that owned things can't. So that's maybe at the basis of some of this.
Paul, when I work with historic documents, I often think of them traveling through time, being touched or handled by people in the past. How would you describe the time relationship in your images, where in many cases you have combined a geologic object with something more current?
Yeah, time. Time is really important to me in my work in funny ways, I guess. With the paper collages, there's a sense almost of recent geological time because you can see where the layers have been accreted and where they've been ripped away, and you can kind of see, well, this is the most recent thing and this is the oldest thing in that layer. It's almost like looking at strata in geology. So when I take those sections of posters or whatever that I've found or ripped off and then recombine them with other ones, you know, I'm making fault lines within that geology. I'm mixing things in a strange way, so it's multiple senses of time. And then, of course, the imagery that's involved in them can refer to a specific time, but sometimes doesn't. It's too abstract. So what you have is a very complicated kind of amalgam of times, not just a single time. And that sort of concept of time to me is important. We tend to live in conceptually a linear time where, you know, we're starting here, we're going here, we're going to do this next thing, and we just kind of keep going on it like a treadmill until it stops for us. Then there are other concepts of time that are more circular, seasonal time, that sort of thing. And actually, I've come to try and think about time in a sense where it is linear, but it's linear like spaghetti in a bowl. So some of it curls on top of other times, and you've got depth to those layers of time. And sometimes those places where times cross, you can kind of punch through. It's like a wormhole. So you can find yourself with an ancient object that's 20,000 years old, and you get some inkling of what that was for, say, the people who made it. Never a full picture, but it allows you to sort of punch through that time, and it resonates with you differently. So time's a real complicated thing in the work, and it's sort of maybe a subtext to the visual aspects of it.
To continue on with the time theme, you shared a quote from T.S. Eliot earlier, quote, "To be conscious is to not be in time," unquote. What does this mean for those visiting this exhibit and seeing these images?
Yeah, so I was rereading some T.S. Eliot, the Four Quartets, and there's this line just kind of by itself. To be conscious is to not be in time, to be outside of time, which is really kind of a Zen-like idea of time. And it just the line itself in our day and age stops you short, right? Because we're on that treadmill of linear time. It's like, wait a minute, I thought I was being fully conscious on this treadmill. And what he's saying, in fact, is that no, you're part of the machinery of a certain idea of time when you're doing that, but you're not conscious at that point. And maybe the closest example to try and have people understand that the concept he's working at is the idea of being in the zone, as we say. So when you are in the studio, in my instance, or a place like that where you're fully concentrated on what you're doing at the moment, time sort of falls away, it disappears. It isn't something you are aware of anymore. And that way, you are fully sort of yourself with the activity. It's a hard thing for Westerners to grasp, I think. We are so goal-oriented, and we're always after the next task to knock off the list. But when something can stop you short and make you contemplate, and then it becomes sort of like a rock thrown into a still pool, and you get these nice resonances that wave out to the shore and they come back, and there's depth to it. And it makes you aware better, I think, of your place in the universe. And I think that's what Eliot was getting at. And hopefully with the images, too, they sort of do that. They're these simple combinations of things in pairs that, in some cases, you don't even know what they are. And they've made this brief connection with one another, even look like they're colliding sometimes. And then that's going to come apart, and they'll have a new relationship with another object, or they'll be eventually back in the world of many objects. So it's just that moment where we see that interaction and that relationship that makes us think of other moments, other interactions. It broadens out into more of a universal, holistic look at things.
Getting back to the T.S. Eliot quote and also your concept of a cone, I'm wondering if you see these images as a riddle in some way.
You know, that's a little hard for me to say. This happens with the sound collages as well, too, because I can identify a lot more in them than the viewer would, and I forget that occasionally because I was there when I found the object or when I recorded the sound. Although there are cases I forget, you know, where these things have come from. So for me, it's less of a riddle than it is just dealing with the things as they are in the relationship. Like with the sound collages, sometimes the least interesting thing to do is trying to identify, oh, what's that sound, what's that sound? Because it's about how they all come together and how they are sort of disembodied from us in a way already. They're abstracted. Just an example, when people listen to music or hear sounds attentively, they forget how much visual stimuli is affecting how they're hearing it. And when you take that away, when you're presenting just the sound, it can be very disorienting, even when it's a sound you're you know, accustomed to, like a refrigerator humming or something. Out of context, you're not quite sure what that is. Same thing happens a little bit here. These are rocks and feathers and bones and so forth, but they're out of their context. They are also out of their context in terms of scale. I'm photographing them, and they're much bigger in the photographs, and especially here, than they are in reality. So it kind of makes them more monumental. So I guess the riddle aspect is maybe something people experience, but it's not something I strive for. It's maybe a little more direct for me.
After this exhibit, these images will continue to be available in special collections as part of an artist's compendium. And for you, is there a difference between how people experience that compendium as opposed to coming and seeing these images? Is there a difference or not?
Yeah, and maybe it's a little bit like if you see images in an exhibition, obviously this thing called the exhibition's been made to focus on, you know, a certain span of work by an artist or artists. So it's drawing your attention specifically to them, and maybe even within that to something specific about them. When it's part of a compendium of other works, other artists, then it becomes a little more museum-like maybe, or maybe it's more studio-like, depending how the work is held together. You could easily see some of these images being combined with other images from even special collections, from, you know, books that seem to share something about the approach to image making that's here, or just the ideas that arise from them. So it's another level of interactions then, right? So I've made my case with these images of how I think these things interact, but there are other possibilities with other artworks, other objects, maybe even something you find on the street and bring in. So it just adds yet another layer to the potential for that.
What else do you want viewers to experience when they see these images?
It was a time when I wanted to sort of declutter myself mentally and otherwise, and going to Comacina seemed perfect for that. It was, you know, a really sort of basic place in a way. The housing was an elegant, interestingly designed building, but it was very basic. The island is basic. I could shed a lot of stuff that I had been kind of dealing with, and I could start fresh in approaching things. And so for me, it was sort of an act of active contemplation to put these together and to photograph them, and I'm certainly hoping that that comes across to the viewer. I think one of the problems with especially American society, which is very kinetic, it's all about moving and doing, and we mean that in a very physical, literal way often. But the act of close looking and viewing and contemplation actually, you know, is not a passive thing at all. It's something that the brain is like really working at. So that's what I want these works to do in some sense.
Is there anything else you would like to share about this exhibit?
I think maybe just to go back to one of the earlier questions about the found and how I came to use that as sort of as the touchstone for a lot of this work, no pun intended. I have a mentor, a really fine painter, James Rosen, who always exhorted his students to have a philosophy about the art they made, to really come up with sort of a mental structure that both sort of encompassed it and defined it to some degree, but also allowed you to move within it and to have sort of a common thread through the work you did. And for me, it evolved that everything I did involved the found in some sense. So found sounds that I make collages from, found paper material that I make more traditional material collages from, or the found things from Comacina, for example, which are natural, man-made. They're all sorts of different things. But you can see the commonality then, regardless of the aesthetic approach that I end up using, regardless of the sort of phenotype, let's say, of the works themselves, the outward appearance versus the genotype that holds them all together, which is the found.
Thanks, Paul, so much for sharing your thoughts about this exhibit. Now we're going to begin the question and answer session, which will be moderated by our Public Services Archivist, Rebecca Peterson-May. Rebecca, take it away.
Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Paul. So I'll be just asking the questions that you all have submitted in your chat. I encourage you to continue putting those in there. We will get to as many as we can in our allotted time, and I'm sure Paul would be happy to follow up offline with the questions we don't get to. So I'm just going to not show my face because I'm not important to this. You'll just hear my voice asking the questions. So let me go to the first question I see is, how does Paul access his inner child?
By not growing up, I suppose. That's a good question. I think as an artist, that's maybe what you have to access most, right? Was it Picasso was always saying how you have to unlearn being an artist to go back to the way you drew as a child. That's probably the best I can say anything about.
Thank you. All right, the next question that came in, can you address the sense of light in the photos? The all-pervasive washed out light gives the photos a sense of nostalgia and memory.
It's interesting. My take on that's a little different, but I can talk about how I ended up lighting the objects in order to photograph them. Initially, I had set up sort of a photo backdrop just out of paper against a chair and shot the images against that, but I didn't like the way the shadows were too present. And in the space where I was staying at the time, there was this large kind of milk glass table, so the glass is translucent. And there were a lot of different light sources in the building, so the light was sort of suffusing up through the table, sort of glowing up through the surface of the table. And I just was laying the objects on that table and realized that it was just the right amount of light in the sense that it defeated some of the shadow and allowed the objects sort of to levitate off a little bit without totally losing the shadow. And then the process of preparing the photographs for printing, I went into those backgrounds and removed all color from them. I left all the color from the different light sources that were hitting the objects in the objects, but I took all the rest of it out of those gray backgrounds so that they would look like they were more displaced even than they were.
Thank you. All right, our next question is, collecting these things and photographing or acknowledging these things a way of being more present in the world yourself?
For me, definitely, yeah. And my other work is made largely from found items, so I'm always trying to kind of negotiate the world through the things that are already there, in a sense, the things both natural and man-made that we maybe encounter every day, kind of normal quotidian things, but seem to me to have value beyond the just product value or object value they might otherwise have. So in collecting these things, the initial impulse is childlike in the sense that, oh, that's just an interesting looking thing. So I'll pick up and collect things like I did for these photographs. And in the end, we had boxes of them in the house. And just started rearranging them. And once you start paying close attention to them, they take on a different aspect. They reveal a certain character to you, and they're objects in the world, and people are objects in the world, and there are relationships between all kinds of objects. And I was trying to explore the relationships I saw between these found things.
Paul, it seems that your non-Western approach to the ongoing search of the artist allows you to communicate in a unique way. As you were trained in the West, what are the readings that guide you?
Readings, that's interesting. Well, I guess in recent years, I read a lot of John Cage, and he's, of course, someone who is very interested in more of an Eastern approach, or an Eastern approach brought to the West so that there's an amalgam of things. But there have been a number of Western artists too who kind of break out of how they were taught, especially a century or half a century ago. A number of painters you can look at seem to transcend the sort of Western infatuation with the purely material and see some spiritual or other dimension in it. So it's not uncommon among artists, I don't think, even Western artists. But for me, in these works in particular, it's probably more apparent than it might be in some of my other works at first, because there is this sort of deep focus on just a few solitary things. And you think, of course, of like Zen rock gardens or something where there's a ground laid out that's a backdrop for the relationships of these objects. And that ground is carefully prepared. So it's a place of contemplation. That's probably a little less apparent in some of my other works, although that philosophical thread does flow through them.
Your description of linear time as noodle-like is very compelling. Could you say more about how or when this sensibility came into the work?
That's interesting. Yeah. When did it come in? It came as a realization to me. It came about as conversations with this mentor I mentioned, James Rosen, because his work is so much about, in his case, a painted image, usually large, but a painted image that takes time to sort of evolve in front of your eyes, to sort of present itself to you. It looks, interestingly, in some ways, just like a gray panel or something. But as you spend time with it, it emanates from the surface. And so we started talking a lot about time in his work and how he conceived of time. And his concept of it made a lot of sense to me that, on a daily level, we seem to live in this linear time frame. We're aware of seasonal time and yearly time. But really time, like so much about humans, is something we've kind of made up constructs for. And we kind of choose which ones we adhere to. And the interesting thing is there are different times, right? We can choose this construct and that construct. And really maybe it's some combination of the 2, 3, or 4 working together in a way that allows us to see time not as only unidirectional, but in multi-directional. And that was helpful for me. I think if you pay attention to it, you'll see it play out in your own life too. I mean, mentally you move back and forward in time, but there are places where they overlap. There's the sense of deja vu. There are all those things that seem to indicate sort of a rupture in time, or that thing I was talking about where you punch through one time into another, even if it's brief. So it came from a variety of places, but these talks with Jim Rosen were very illuminating for me, and it made me see my own work in a little bit different light.
If there was a sound or music to accompany this exhibition, what would it be?
That's interesting, because I do work with sound. I do sound collages, and it's always been my argument that they needed to be listened to, considered separately from visual stimuli, and vice versa. So I never really thought of sound accompanying these works. To me, that they were sufficient as visual works. Um, Although I look at two or three of them, and to me they seem to make a sound in a way through a visual means. Um, I don't know what that sound is though. It's a conundrum. It's like it's making a sound, but I'm not hearing it yet. It's purely in its visual manifestation.
Why was it important to bind these images into the book? At the show in Italy, you mentioned the book was displayed as well as each page individually hung on the wall. Is one more successful?
It was always, from the moment I really knew I was taking these images seriously, I had settled on the pairing of the objects and that sort of thing. I immediately conceived of it as a book. Wasn't sure what form the book would take, but I knew I wanted it to be a book. And that clarified for me as I went forward. What I've learned is in presenting it, because it's really difficult to have the book as something that everyone can pick up and thumb through, that I needed to make a set of the prints that are in the book as just exhibition prints. So I did that, and I have just a set now that are the same as the book pages, but trimmed so that the part that's under the binding doesn't show, which would just been a white strip on the side. But otherwise, they're the same image pages that are in the book. But it just allows the viewer to see the whole thing if they can't pick it up and actually look through it.
I have one more question that was submitted earlier, so it's not in the chat window, but if anyone has more questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat window. So the question that came in is, I'm curious about scale. The works at special collections are printed smaller for the flat cases, maybe to connect to the scale of the images in the book, and significantly larger for the walls. You mentioned also in the video that the items themselves aren't always shot to scale. What are your thoughts here?
And we get into a little bit of a discussion between scale and size too. But like I just mentioned, although the pages that are in the cases flat in the exhibition they might appear to be smaller than the ones in the book, they are the same size. They're from the same prints. So those are of equal size, but there are enlargements of some of the images in the wall cases that are, so they're hung on the wall in the space. And they're significantly larger. And they're also of object pairings that I didn't use in the book, that I chose not to. Not because they were less good, but because they just didn't fit with the groupings I wanted. And so it was very interesting to me to enlarge those, 10, 12 times what the book pages are. And all of them are out of scale in the sense that even the book pages, those images of the objects make the objects look larger than they are. I've got a few of them right here, actually. So, like you might recognize this rock that's in one of the photographs. This rock appears in two of the pages, so it's very small. It appears with this crazy piece of cardboard stuff. So they look larger in those image pages. It makes them look more monumental in a way. For the viewer who doesn't get to see the actual objects, they find themselves maybe a little bit disoriented or unsure of the nature of the objects. They might look at it and say, "Oh, that's a rock, but that looks really big." And I sort of like that displacement. I want there to be just a little bit of an uneasiness between the viewer and the objects, so that maybe they're more on a par. If you saw these at their actual size reproduced, they would look far less significant to you. So this brings them up into your space a little bit more, so you have to deal with them as entities a little bit more.
Okay, I've gotten I've gotten a question for you to my personal cell phone via text. So this Questions are coming from all over. And actually, I think this is similar to one that is in the chat, so I'm going to put them together and you can do what you want with them.
Okay.
What other places would you like to explore in this manner? And then in addition to that, where are you going next in your work?
Neither question can I really answer. I didn't go to Comacina expecting to make this work. It's something that I just responded to in the place. And this was the work I felt I needed to make to, sort of express my time there, my sense of being there, and the relationship of these objects. And if I knew where my work was going next, I might not do it. So it's always a process of discovery for me. The material helps drive a conversation for me. So I collect a lot of different material. My other work tends to be paper collages and sound collages. So I'm always collecting those things. And I find that if I sort of pay attention to the material and, listen to it more or less, that it'll indicate ways for me to take it.
Great, thank you so much. I believe, unless I get more texts, those are the, oh, wait, I get one more. Are you in any sense encouraging a shift in human action from constantly making stuff, more and more objects and buildings, and toward making new things out of what is already there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I do have a sense of the enoughness of the world, that there's plenty in our world, things, buildings, people, certainly. So my concentration in terms of material for making work is not to try and create lots of new things, although I fail in that, obviously. Every time I make a collage, it's something else out in the world. But to try and use from the material that's already there, which I find interesting. It comes with its own kind of scrambled history, usually. It comes with its own associations that when you start playing with it, even in abstract compositions, to me, it adds a certain life or richness to things. Whereas if I were painting, like at one time I painted some, you feel more like you're creating from nothing, even if you aren't. And in this case, it's just maybe more of an admission of creating from something that's already there and doing a bit of alchemy to it in a way.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I believe that is the end of the questions that have come in. So as far as Q&A, and like I said, I'm sure Paul would be happy to continue talking about this offline. You can request to come see the exhibit by emailing archives@wfu.edu. The library is currently closed, but we can arrange private viewings of that. And I know Tanya Zanish-Belcher has put in the text, the chat box, to thank everyone for coming. Of course, thank you to Paul. And I will toss it back over to Tanya.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And thank you to everyone for attending today. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, audience, for having such great and thoughtful questions. And we look forward to seeing you all again. And I hope you come schedule an appointment to see Comacina. Just email us at archives@wfu.edu, and we'll be happy to set some time aside for you, sanitizing before and sanitizing after. It is well worth to come and see it in our space. So everyone have a good day, and we will be back soon with more programming in March and April. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.